Hello everyone, my name is Claudius Cazan. In this video, we take a look for the first time at a very simple harmonic progression. The one of the chord of the 1 to the 5 and back to the 1. And we do this in choral style, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, because that's a little more restrictive, so please stay tuned. Welcome back. Let's, before we dive into harmonic progressions, let's do one thing in here that I thought we needed to clear out a little bit. You might hear certain theorists or teachers in different colleges or university talk about positions versus inversions. Okay, we talked about inversions already, and we know that the inversion, it's usually dictated but what's in the bass note. Okay, so whatever part of the triad you have in the bass, that gives you the inversion. Okay, except the root position. Root position, you know, we call it a position because I don't know, for some reason they didn't want to call it the root inversion. It should have been called a root inversion because it's more appropriate. We're talking about inversions, but they called it a root position. But when we talk about positions, we usually use the term to signify what goes in the soprano, the highest sounding note. And on the tablet here, I have a little schematic of what we call the octave position, the third position, and the fifth position. And that's dictated by what we have in the soprano. That's why I circled the soprano notes. Okay, let's look at the first one, the octave position. We call it the octave position because the note in the soprano, it's at an octave with what's in the bass. Okay, these are, by the way, these are all root position chords. Okay, you can see that we have the same note in the bass, and because we have the same note in the bass, we have the same inversion. Okay, it's called the root position. Okay, the position in the term root position should have been, exchanged with the term inversion, but for some reason we call it a root position. Anyway, do not confuse the two terms. Inversions are for the inversions, okay? And the positions usually it's for what goes in the soprano. So you can see in here, in the octave position, if I play this chord in here, the first chord, you can see that the G is also in the soprano, at an octave apart from the bass, which is also the root of the chord. Okay, we called it the octave position. You could have it 2 octaves higher, but we still call it the octave. Remember, we reduce all compound intervals to simple intervals, up to 1 octave. Now, in the second example, you can see that the B is in the soprano. Okay, we call that the third position. Okay? So the B being in the soprano, we call that the third position. In the third example, we have D in the soprano. Okay? And that's called the fifth position because the fifth of the chord, which is D, is in the soprano. It's not so terribly important, but you might find from time to time people talking about positions rather than inversions. Do not confuse the two of them. The inversions are the most important ones. But if you hear somebody talking about position, think about what goes into the soprano. The bass and the soprano voices are usually the most important voices because the human ear tends to pick on these two versions immediately. Okay? First is the soprano because the sopranos carry the melodies. And then you have the basses who sustain the harmonies and give you the inversions of the chords and so on that dictate where the chords move and so on. And the inner two voices, the tenors and the altos, are basically just fill-in voices. Okay? We're going to look very carefully at what happens when we move from one chord to the other and in respect to all these inner voices and everything else. Okay? So just remember a little bit about this. All right. One other thing that I want to clarify too, we're going to do some harmonic analysis and some harmonic writing a little bit later. And let's put some rules and some best practices in here. Number one, if a triad in root position, okay, you're not expected to put anything underneath. Remember I said triad, meaning 3 notes, not a 7th chord. If it's a 7th chord, you have to notate it with a 7 in root position, right? To differentiate it between, from a triad that has no figures. So if you see no figures under a chord, you assume that it's a chord in root position as a triad, not a 7th chord, okay? So that's number 1. Number 2, if the third of the triad is to be altered, okay? Altered meaning brought up, naturalized, or flattened, okay? You will usually see a flat or a sharp or a natural sign under that chord, okay? And if you only see that figure, that sharp, the flat, or the natural sign, that always refers to the third of the chord, okay? So if you're given the note, that means that's your root, that's the most important note, right? And since there's no numbers, it means it's a root position. But if you also see a sharp, a flat, or a natural sign, that means that you have to do something to the third of that chord. And here I'm starting with a sharp under a D. Notice we're in G minor, okay? We have 2 flats in the key signature, all right? So if G is your tonic, okay, that would be the chord of the 1. D would be your 5th degree, okay? So let's say that we have this sharp underneath, right, on the 5th degree, and we have to score this as a triad because there's no other figures in there to tell us otherwise. Okay, so it would be a triad in root position, D, F, and A. This would be the chord of the 5. But notice one thing, we have a sharp under that D. What's a third up from that D? It's F, right? But that F now needs to be sharpened. Okay? So, this is how we need to score this, as a major triad, not as a minor triad. Okay? So, wherever that F sharp appears, and whatever voice, in this case it's in the alto, that has to be sharpened. Okay? So then this sounds like this. That happens to be the chord of the 5 as a triad, not a 7th chord, and most likely it will resolve back to the chord of the 1, which is G minor, like this. Okay? So that's another thing to remember. If you see these accidentals by themselves under notes, they always refer to the third of the chord. Here's another example, this time with a natural sign, okay? We're in F minor here, 4 flats in the key signature, okay? So this would be the root of the chord, right? The tonic chord, the root of the tonic chord of the 1. But then we have a C in there, okay? That's the 5th or the 5th degree, okay? And if that natural sign refers to the 3rd, we need to score an E natural in there instead of an E flat, because the key signature says, hey, you should have an E flat in there, right? Like this. But no, because we have the natural sign, we have to score it with an E natural. Okay? That means it would be a chord like this. Okay? Again, moving back to the chord of the tonic, which is minor because we're in F minor. Let's look at one more, this time with a flat. Let's say we're on a B flat major, okay? B flat major, that's the root of the tonic chord, okay? And then we have an E flat in here with a E flat by itself, meaning that it refers to the third of the chord, which is G, but instead of having a G natural, as the key signature would indicate, we need to flatten that to G flat. And the chord will sound like this. And we'll resolve back to B flat. Okay? So in this case, kind of we go backwards. We go from a minor triad resolving to a major triad. Before we had it the opposite. Okay? So just remember this. If you see accidentals by themselves under notes, they refer to the third of the chord. And you have to adjust them accordingly. Okay, great. Let's go on now and look at some very simple harmonic progressions. Today we're going to talk about the harmonic progression that happens between the chord of the 1, okay? If you are in a major key, is going to be a major chord, a major triad, all right? And if you're in a minor key. It's going to be a minor triad. And we're going to go to the chord of the 5, or the dominant, and back to the 1. Okay? Notice there are no figures in here. If you look at my first example on the first line there, capital 1, Roman numeral, capital 1 to 5 to 1. There's no other figures in there, meaning that these are all triads. We're not dealing with 7th chords quite yet. And later on, from the middle of the staff on, I am scoring those in 4 parts. Okay? 2 of the voices go on the bass clef, and the other 2 on the top treble clef. Okay? And it sounds like this. Let me play them for you first. Very simple progression, okay, but it has a lot of implications in here. Okay, number 1, we need to see what the bass is doing. That's one of the most important things, okay? The bass moved from C, which is the root of the tonic chord, C, to the root of the 5 chord, which is G. And it does that this time by moving up. Could I have moved it down? Absolutely, you can move it down as well. And but it's better in this case to move it up, and I'll explain in a second why. And then we're moving it back to 1 again. So the bass is allowed to skip because of all these chords involved. We don't always have chords that move stepwise, okay? Especially in these harmonic progressions, you go from 1 to 5. So obviously the bass has to skip that 5th, okay? Very good. Now let's see how I scored the first chord, okay? This is, by the way, in octave position. Now that you know about the octave position, the C, the root of the chord, it's also present in the soprano. That means the octave position, okay? And obviously the root of the chord is also in the bass. And I gave the E to the tenors and the G to the altos. Okay? Now, when you score anything like this, you have to keep in mind a few things. Number 1, voice ranges. Am I within the voice ranges allowed for all the voices? And I'm looking at the tenor because that's the most problematic in here. It's not a problem actually because the tenors can go all the way to G. Right now it's at an E, which is perfectly fine. And I can see that all the other voices are within their allowed ranges. So not a problem there. Okay. Let's go now and look at how I scored the second chord. The second chord is scored like this. Okay. And notice one thing. When we come from the first chord to the second, okay, you will notice that there's a few elements in here that are very important. Number 1 is that common note that exists between these 2 chords. So one of the things that you have to always look for is common notes. Do we have common notes between these chords? And if you do, it's probably best to keep the common notes. Okay? So the voice where in which these common notes occur, it better stay at that same note because that makes for the most smooth transition between the 2 chords. So keep common notes going. So you can see that common note there is between the 2 G's in the alto. Okay, so the alto basically keeps the same note going. Okay, now what do the other voices do? Of course, the bass moves up. We talked about that. But look at the other 2 voices. The tenors and the sopranos actually move down by step. Okay, so that's another thing is, if you can move stepwise between these notes, do it stepwise. Do not skip. Okay, so keep common tones when possible, and also move as much as you can stepwise. That's why this is such a smooth transition here. You can see how these voices up in the upper 3 voices are so close together, and they don't have to do much. Of course, the bass has to jump, but that's we talked about that already. Okay, and the same thing happens when we resolve the chord back to the 1. Okay, so let's recapitulate really quickly in here. The bass has to do what the bass needs to do. okay, because of the chord change. Going from a 1 to a 5, the bass has to jump that fifth. All right? But the other voices, keep the common tone as much as you can, and the other voices, see if you can make them move stepwise. Okay? Now, one other thing that's very important in here, look at on the second chord. Look at the second chord. The distance, how do we approach octaves and fifth? Those are very important. Meaning, are there octaves and fifth in your second chord? Yes, there are. The fifth between the bass and the tenor, that's a fifth, right? Then it happens to be a perfect fifth. How do we approach that fifth? You can see that the bass moves up to it, up to the G, and the tenor comes down from the E into that fifth. So we call this an approach by contrary motion, okay? Meaning that the two voices are moving towards each other, okay? Which is perfectly fine. Most of the time when you do approach fifth and octaves, try to do it by contrary motion. That's one of the best ways to do it. And that's exactly what happens in here, okay? How about octaves? How about the octave that's formed between the bass and the alto? You have that G to G. How is that approached? Well, you can see, well, the bass is moving up into the octave, but the alto is actually sustaining that common chord from the previous chord. This is called an oblique motion. Why? Because one voice stays and the other one moves. Okay? That means oblique, which means from the French, meaning slanted. Okay? So oblique motion is perfectly fine again, as long as one voice stays, the other one can move. Okay? So two great ways to approach perfect octaves and fifth into a chord is either by contrary motion or oblique motion. Okay? One thing that we really want to stay away from is parallel motion, especially if both voices are moving by the same amount. For example, something like this would not be good. Perfect fifth to another perfect fifth to another perfect fifth. Okay? We tried to, or perfect octaves like this, between any given voices. We don't want to do that. Okay? So remember, contrary motion is fine, oblique motion is fine. We want to try to stay away from parallel motion. There is no parallel motion in here, as you can see. You can stop the video at this point and you can look at the voices and see how they are moving. Okay? Keep the common tones, very good. Move by stepwise, very good. Except the bass. The bass needs to do what the bass does, and it moves to its own, notes that it has to move to. So in this case, from 1 to the 5. So that's that skip of a fifth up and down. Perfectly good. All right. By the way, here we're in the key of C because I wanted to start with something that has no sharps or flats. All right. Let's look at another example this time. Let's see if my tablet moves. Finally. Okay. Well, this is a representation of what I was talking about, but spread out over the entire staff here, so you can see exactly what's going on. And I'm showing the common note in there with the big ties. Okay? You won't see the ties in actual music. This is just for me to show you, actually, that these notes are being kept in common. Okay? Very good. Let's look at something else in here. Actually, what I'm saying in here, rule number one, keep common tones as much as possible. Rule number two that we talked about, move by stepwise, with the other voices. So you can see I put the arrows in here, and this is how the other voices move, okay? In this case, the sopranos and the tenors are actually moving, okay, by step. Okay, the bass is exempt from that because they have to do what they have to do, okay? So move stepwise as much as possible, especially with the inner voices, okay? You'll notice that when we harmonize things, sometimes we don't have the freedom to move stepwise with the sopranos. You know, we are harmonizing an existing tune already that has its own shape and so on. So if the sopranos have to jump around and the bass has to jump around, it's really good for the inner voices to start moving stepwise, okay, to counteract all those jumps in these outer two voices. So that's why the rule is there, okay? And now rule number 3 here, we always check for parallels, or if we have the right motion into fifth or octaves. Okay, you know, we don't want to have a parallel fifth, and we do want to have oblique motion or contrary motion. Okay, and that's why, you know, with the red ties in there, you can see how I highlighted those intervals that we have to be especially careful with. Okay, the octaves and the fifth, and how they are approached. Follow those black arrows to see, you know, and the fifth on the second chord is approached by contrary motion. The bass moves up from below, and the tenor comes down from the top. Okay. Also, the octave in that second chord is approached by oblique motion. The bass comes from the bottom, but the alto sustains the note present also in the first chord. Okay? And same thing when we move to the chord of the 1 back in there. You can stop the video and look at it. All right, very good. This one tells you about this rule here. Contrary and oblique motions are okay when approaching perfect fifth and octaves, but not parallels. Okay, we try to stay away from parallel fifth and octaves as much as we can. All right, let's take a look at another harmonic progression of the 1-5-1, this time in a minor key. Okay, this is in D minor. We have 1 flat in the key signature, and these are the triads. Okay, I always put the triads involved in the very beginning, just for you to know what notes we're going to have to deal with. So it's probably a good practice to dedicate a little bit of a music paper corner somewhere where you can sketch your triads. All the notes, or 7th chords later, all the notes that you have to deal with, and put those in root position, because that's what you need to. So we have here the chord of the 1 in root position, all right, and the chord of the 5 in root position. Remember, the chord of the 5, it's always a major chord. Otherwise, we're going to run into some issues and so. And we're borrowing these C sharp in this case from the harmonic and the melodic forms of the minor, okay? That C sharp in there, by the way, it's the leading tone in the key of D minor. That's why we like to use the forms of the minor that have leading tones, the harmonic and the melodic. So that's why you see the C sharp in there, okay? And that's the chord of the 5, and that's why it's with a capital Roman numeral 5, because it's a major triad, okay? But the chord of the 1, it's a minor triad, okay? And let's look to see how I am scoring this in four parts. So I picked this one at the beginning. Okay. By the way, that chord, the first chord, is in 3rd position, meaning that the 3rd of the chord is in the soprano. It's a root position also, by the way, but it's in that 3rd position because the 3rd of the chord is in the soprano, right? And it moves down to here and back here. Okay. Now, let's see if we can remember some of those rules. Number 1, keep notes in common. Do I keep the notes in common? Any notes that are in common here? Yes. In the tenor, you can see how I show that with the big ties. Okay? The other voices have to move stepwise. Do they move stepwise? Yes. The other 2 voices in this case are the sopranos and the altos. They go down by step. And up again. And in this case, it's so smooth because both of them are going down by half step, okay? Okay? While the bass and the bass does its own thing. At this time, it moves down to the root of the chord of the 5. Okay? Okay, instead of up. Okay? Now, you're going to ask me, yeah, but look at this. Between the bass now and the soprano, we have that 5th, A to E, right? Well, of course, it's bigger than an octave, but remember, we reduce everything to simple intervals. But we never talked about this particular approach. Both are moving down. So it's not contrary motion, it's not oblique motion, it's not parallel motion. This motion, when both are moving in the same direction, hitting that important interval of an octave or fifth, but by not the same amount, so it's not a parallel motion, it's called a direct motion. And direct motion is kind of okay if at least one of the voices is moving by step. Okay? So that's important. At least one of your voices has to be moving by step. If both voices are leaping into this, you know, in the same direction, it's not as good. Okay? But in this case, I'm going to let it slide because the soprano is moving by half step down. Well, of course, the bass has to leap down to the a fourth down from the previous chord. All right, so now you know about another type of motion called direct motion. And it's okay to do direct motion if one of your voices is moving by step. And this is exactly what happens. And the reverse is true, of course, in the movement from the 5 to the 1. All right, good. One more. Actually, in here, what I wanted to do, this is probably what you guys should have. I have a checklist. Okay, you can see those 6 points in here that I've created in here. Whenever I'm moving from one chord to the other, I go through this checklist every time. And one is, the first thing is this: respect the voice ranges. Do I respect the voice ranges? Yes, it gets a green check. Okay. Do I have more than an octave between the upper 3 voices? I don't, which is good. Another green check. Do I cross voices? Okay, meaning one voice higher than the other, and you, for example, your tenor should not be higher than your alto. Okay, crossing voices like that. No, they don't. So another green check. That's good. How about keep common notes as much as possible? Yes, in the tenor, I'm keeping the common note in there. Check. How about moving stepwise between other voices? As much as possible, of course. Yes, I am. Another green check. And finally, I'm checking for how I approach those parallel, those fifth and octaves, not parallels, I'm sorry. Okay? And in this case, in middle chord, it's by direct motion, okay? And also direct motion when I go back to the chord of the 1, which is fine, but make sure that at least one of your voices is doing this by step, okay? Very good. Let's do one more in here. We're in key to E. E major, right? So this is a major key. This is your tonic chord in root position, and this is your dominant chord, or the 5 in root position also. B, D sharp, F sharp, and back to the 1. Okay, remember, E major has 4 sharps and a key signature, so we have to respect the key signature. Okay, so now, look at this. The first chord, what's in the soprano? It's the B. A B is a 5th away from your root. So we're in the 5th position here, okay? Of course, the chord is in root position, okay? We call it root position. Should have been called root inversion, but it's called root position. But the position of the actual chord is in 5th position because in the soprano, we have the 5th of the chord. And this is how this progression sounds. Okay? So, very good. This is my interpretation of this. It's kind of boring because now the common note is given to the soprano. So the sopranos usually have the most interesting of movements because they harmonize a pre-existing tune, or you want to try to make the tune interesting. If you start having too many common notes in the soprano, your chorale or your tune is going to sound a little boring. So, but I wanted to illustrate the fact that you could have common notes in the sopranos, and it's perfectly fine. So I do keep the common notes going between the chords. The other voices are moving by step. meaning in this case the inner voices, the tenors and the altos, are moving stepwise down and back up. And of course the bass is free to move from the 1 to the 5 and back to the 1. Okay, now let's do the same thing in here and put our checklist in there. Do I respect the voice ranges? Yes, I do. The tenor is the highest one in there, but it's way within the range of the tenors, so it gets a check. Do I have more than an octave between the upper 3 voices? I don't, and that's very safe. It gets a check. Do I cross voices? I do not cross voices, right? Every voice, it's wherever it's supposed to be, then that's fine. It gets another check. Keep common tones as much as possible. I do. You can see that in the soprano, another green check mark. Move stepwise as much as possible. Yes, we can see the altos and the tenors are doing exactly that. Another check. And no parallel fifth or octaves. We don't have them. We checked in here. And we do have a direct motion in here between the bass and the... Actually, no, not this time. This time we have oblique motion, okay, between the octave and the second chord. The B's are approached, the bass goes down, but the soprano sustain, okay. How about the fifth? Actually, we do have a direct between the B and the F sharp in the second chord, okay. And we do this by going like this. Okay? You can see exactly what I'm talking about right now. Both voices are moving down, but not by the same amount, and one of the voices at least is by step, and that is in your alto. Okay? So very important to keep this checklist whenever you move from each chord. Okay? Great, and this one gets a checklist check mark as well. So no parallel octaves or fifth. Very, very, very important. And we already talked about the direct fifth that happens in here. So you know all about this. All right, so with this, we're going to leave it like this because there's quite a little bit of terminology in here and it gets a little bit technical. You can rewind the video and look at all these examples. Next week, we're going to look at the chord of the 1 to the 4 and back. Okay? And if we have time, maybe we'll look at the 1 to the 4, then to the 5, and back to the 1. We're going to make it a little bit longer. Okay? So we'll see about that. Very good. Excellent. Let's move on now to the solfege that you guys had to prepare for today. And that is solfege number 34. All right? If you requested the solfege from me, you can see that it's written in the key of F. F major, because it has one flat, okay, in the key signature. And where are the challenges in here? Number one is with these changing meters, right? Going from the 4/4 and then to the 2/4 and to the 3/4 and so on. Okay, you have all these going back and forth also between triplets and straight eighth notes. That's been our trademark here for quite some time now, and this is very important. You should be able to switch quickly between triplets and straight eighth notes. But look in on the second line, last measure. You have a triplet here going across 2 beats. So it's not a beat triplet like all the other ones, the ones, you know, with the 3 on top of the beam or under the beam. This one, actually, you have to fit 3 quarter notes in the place of 2. So that becomes a little more difficult. I'm going to perform it for you so you see exactly how that is done. Maybe you already figured it out, which is great, but we haven't seen that kind of a tuplet before. A triplet, 3 notes, 3 quarter notes in the place of 2. So basically you have to fit 3 notes within 2 beats. You know, we were able to fit 3 subdivisions of 1 beat, but how do you fit now 3 notes when normally you would only have 2? Okay, that's still called a tuplet. Okay, I'm looking to see if there's anything else that's challenging in here. Of course, there's a couple of large leaps, an octave leap in the last last line, and so on. All right, very good. I'm going to leave the metronome at 70. 70 seems to be a better metronome marking now, since things are getting a little more difficult. Okay, and here's 70. And I'm gonna get my pitch. I probably can get it off the air like that, but let's have it, F major. Okay, remember we have B flat, so we have to be very careful with that. There we go. Fa, sol, la, si, do, re, do, la, fa, sol, mi, re, do, re, mi, fa, mi, re, sol, fa, sol, la, si, do, si, la, sol, do, la, do, fa, sol, mi, re, do, mi, la, fa, mi, re, sol, fa, si, la, sol, do, si, do, mi, sol, mi, la, sol, fa, sol, mi, re, fa, sol, si, la, sol, fa, mi, re. Fa mi sol fa mi la la fa mi sol mi fa mi re mi sol la si do fa mi fa. All right, that will have to do it because it's quite difficult, and the challenging here I think the mostly is your conducting, anticipating how you're going to conduct, and of course the pitches. But with the pitches you're supposed to practice with the keyboard, sound all your pitches and so on, but then put it all together, and the conducting is the most difficult of all. All right, for next time, two more solfeges, number 35 and 36. All right, and we're trying to bring 16th notes into the next solfeges, just as we'll try to bring 16th notes into the starter exercises as well. All right, so let's go to Robert Starr. For today you had to have number 35, I believe. 35, exactly. Changing meters, just like the solfege. Okay, you can see in here that you have, it starts with a 4-4 and moves to a 3-4 and then a 2-4. And at some point you have a 5-4 in here on the third line. Okay, you're being helped with the dotted bar line in there. So conduct on the formula of 3 and then 2 in there, and you're back to a 2-4 for a few bars, and then 3, and finally a 4. So it's not too difficult. You just have to be on your mark with all these changing meters. Number 35, it's has the quarter note as the beat. Okay, that's why you have the triplets going. Okay, but in the number 36, which is your assignment for next time, it's in changing meters in, and the beat is eighth notes. And you aggregate 3 beats together to create one larger beat, and you conduct on the formula of 2-4, 3-4, and so on, depending on what the measure is. For example, in the 9-8, it's the formula of 3. You have a 6-8, it's a formula of 2. If you have a 12-8, okay, like you have in the third line, that's formula of 4. But look, you have a 15-8 also. Last time we did exactly this, the formula of 15-8, and that's, in this case, you go on the formula of 2 first and then 3. Okay, now each beat has 3 subdivisions, and that's why it adds up to 15. Okay, so for next time, just the exercise number 36, but now let me perform for you number 35, also with the metronome at 70. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. All right. This is not too bad, right? Pretty simple. You just have to be on your mark when you get to the 5-4. All right. So when you have 5-4, conduct on the formula of 3 first and then 2. They both add up to 5. And that's about it. So number 36 for next time, and that's it for today. In my next video, I'm going to, you know already, we're going to look at the harmonic progression of the 1 to 4 to the 1, and if we have a little time, maybe we'll start talking about the expanded one, the 1 4 5 1. Okay, and we're going to look at all these voice moving rules again. We're going to make sure that we have our checklist in front of us when we move from one chord to the other, so that we keep it nice and smooth. Again, this is when you score for the choir, for the chorus, for the soprano, alto, tenor, bass. When you score things for an instrument like a keyboard, it's a lot more free because your hands can move freely without all these restrictions of voices. But the human voice, it's a little more limiting. You can see how difficult it is for me to perform these solfeges that have leaps and so on. Remember, when you dealing with choirs, usually you have a lot of non-trained voices. Not everybody's a professional, so you want to make things a little bit easier for them. So that's why all these rules in there. And also sounds better if things are smoother, instead of all the voices, you know, leaping to by large intervals and so on. It doesn't sound quite as nice. So that's what it is. Okay, great. Until next time, I want you guys to stay safe and healthy, right? And be good.